I remember when I was making my choice to apply as a US Fulbright scholar in Azerbaijan, I knew some things about Azerbaijan and the reason I chose to teach journalism there. Can you take us back to what was going through your mind and how much you actually knew about the region of Azerbaijan and Armenia at the time? And
Yeah.
looking back now, how did your adventures in the region shape what you had previously learned back in the US?
It's interesting you asked that. So prior to my teaching career, I was a enlisted Air Force reservist, and one of the drills that we would do basically was like, how does the U.S. intervene in a conflict in a fictitious place that basically was the South Caucasus, right? So like in the 1990s, I used to do like drill. How do we respond to conflict there? And so I didn't know a ton about the region like most Americans do, frankly. And then I moved here to Abu Dhabi, and the fascinating thing about Abu Dhabi is because UAE is home to Emirates and Etihad, you can get around the world in the region quite quickly. And I saw
And
some like,
inexpensively too. Yeah.
yes, exactly, right?
Relatively. Yeah.
Right. And so my first sojourn to the Caucasus actually was to Georgia. And we had a long weekend here, and I went to Tbilisi. And it was right after COVID. And before, let's see, Ukrainian flags were everywhere. So the second invasion had happened. And I loved it. I loved everything about it. I loved the people. I loved the history. I loved like the sense of nationalism and how like Georgians are like, we are not Slavs, we're not Russians, we're Georgians. I loved the Jaja, frankly, which is their national beverage. I loved the Kankali. And I was like, what about these other places? And so I kind of went blind, and I've gone now to Armenia twice. I spent time in Azerbaijan, and I think the Caucasus joined Southeast Asia as maybe my favorite region of the world to travel to.
So I understand that you actually traveled to Azerbaijan and Armenia at a time when hostility was very high between the two countries.
That is
And
correct.
now hearing in the news that they've actually reached some peace agreements, how does that make you feel? What comes to your mind? Is this something you could have imagined back when you were there?
Yeah, well, so it's interesting for me. So I teach a class here called AP Comparative Government Politics, and so like I am a student of comparative like politics essentially. And one of the countries that we look at is Russia, and like Russia's influence on its near abroad. And something that like I've been struck by since moved to the side of the world, and honestly prior to, is like the kind of relationship that the former Soviet states have to Russia. And like I've used the analogy in class that like imagine living in the house next door to your ex-husband. Like that's how these states are, right? And so the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh is a conflict that is got seeds that go back to the Soviet period, right?
Oh,
And
before that.
when I dumb it down for kids, what I basically say is that like about a generation ago, when Azerbaijan was not strong and Armenia was stronger, uh, Armenia imposed their will on the political situation. And over the last generation, the Azeris have invested a lot of their treasure and a lot of their oil revenues into modernizing their economy. And now, like, they're the kid who came back from like sophomore summer from break, like really, really strong. And like they're now imposing their will on the situation. And another thing I'll add that is an element in this is that when I first decided to have a podcast conversation about this on my own show, I posted online, and all the guests that were suggested were Armenian. And I was struck by that because of the Armenian genocide, there's a large Armenian diaspora in the United States, which means there's a very large number of Armenians people who can like come on and give you their point of view. And in addition, the Armenians are predominantly Christian, and so
Mhm.
there's some bit of the doubt that they get, and that's why when Savinch was suggested to me, I was so excited because like there was an Azeri voice. You don't hear the Azeri voice in media, right? It's kind of like how it's not a perfect analogy to the Israel-Palestine conflict, but I can tell you the names of all the Israeli prime ministers. I can tell you of the important cabinet members. I can tell you the names of the people who are like the leaders of the parties in the coalition in the Knesset, right? But I can't tell you a lot about Palestinian voices because we don't hear them in U.S. media. And so essentially I've used my podcast now to, and to be clear, I'm not picking a side in the conflict, but like the Azeri point of view on events is not told because people from Azerbaijan are majority Muslim, and American media doesn't really give a space to Muslim people in conversations, even when the conversations are about them.
An amazing analogy there too. And this something that struck me lately is how prominent Azerbaijan and Armenia have suddenly become
Yes.
in U.S. Media. And I don't remember a U.S. president ever mentioning these two countries before. Maybe Armenia, but never Azerbaijan. But now we hear about them almost every day in the context of these peace talks. That feels like a new reality, certainly to me, and I'm sure it is to many people. Not long ago, if you said Azerbaijan or Armenia, most people wouldn't even know what you were talking about. This is a big change, isn't it?
No, it's a huge change. And actually, it's great because my politics are ever evolving. Like I'm a recovering college Republican who like has become disaffected with mainstream Democratic politics. And like one of the things that I just really genuinely believe is that everybody deserves self-determination. And because of the history of the Soviet Union, because of the history of the Russian Empire, because of post-Soviet Union influence, the people of Azerbaijan and Armenia have been denied self-determination. And so this is a moment where like they're getting their place on the global stage and like we're talking about this conflict. And I think it's really unfortunate that like we're talking about this conflict, but largely through an American lens, right? A lot of the discourse in American media is how does resolving this conflict harm Russia? How can we pull the Azeris into the sphere of American influence? How can we pull the Armenians into the sphere of American influence? How can we build inroads into the Caucasus, which are strategically important and we know throughout history? But like the real conversation should be, do the people of Armenia and Azerbaijan finally get peace in their countries and self-determination over the events that are occurring there? And that's my sincere hope from this. Like, I want this peace deal to lead to people in Baku and people in Yerevan being free and being away from a fear of conflict and feeling like their brightest days are ahead of them rather than they're fighting generation-old battles.
Important aspect is they need to recognize that the other side is not always the enemy, is not the enemy of their grandfather, the enemy of their father, and thus their enemy. I think those are things that have to be resolved, right? Just
Absolutely.
Between the two countries.
No, absolutely. And it's funny because it's the tyranny of small differences. Like you fight the most with the person that you are like most similar to and closest to. Like the Azeris and Armenians have very distinct cultures, right? Like you have a Christian nation, a majority Muslim nation. You have a nation that is a little more stoic and a nation that's the Kardashians, right? Like they're different people for sure, but they have way more in common. And it was funny when I was speaking to Savinch on my show last episode, she talked about how she'd never been to Armenia. And like, that broke my heart a little bit because like, it's the place next door, right? It's like me being from Seattle and saying, I've never been to Vancouver or to Canada. It's right there. And like, my hope is that young people who are growing up in Azerbaijan today and young people who are growing up in Armenia today, a generation from now, see themselves as part of the same region and see a kinship and then are united together. And instead of like being in opposition and oftentimes in opposition imposed by outside actors.
Exactly. And now, from your perspective, however, are Armenia and Azerbaijan moving toward becoming independent, or are they still going to be caught up in the orbit of big powers like the U.S.?
So let's qualify this really fast. I'm a high school teacher, right? Like I'm not an expert on geopolitics. What I would say is that I've heard from very smart people like Savinch on my podcast that because of the war in Ukraine, Russia's ability to impose its will on the region is diminished. And so this is a moment where Armenia, Azerbaijan, but also Moldova, like Georgia, the whole conflict over South Ossetia, like this is an opportunity for these states to assert themselves and kind of reclaim self-determination from geopolitics that's been very Russian dominated. And so it is my hope that both states can move towards more political independence and deciding their own destiny. And it's my hope that people in Azerbaijan have a government that they can believe in and feels like represents their point of view and like has the legitimacy and backing of the people. That's my hope. But like how we get there and if that's guaranteed, I've given up making predictions on the world.
So as a teacher and a podcaster, you've always been about giving people tools to think critically. If you were teaching a class in the US today about the Caucasus, what would be the one misconception you'd want to break down first?
Oh man, just one misconception.
Or you can do a couple.
Okay, good. I think there is an assumption in American media and in American voices about this region that like Russia maintaining control and maintaining influence over the post-Soviet states is legitimate. And I would like to say like that's illegitimate. Like these people deserve self-determination. And if we can stop looking at events in the Caucasus through an American lens and stop looking at events in the Caucasus through a lens of like what's bad for Russia, good for Russia, bad for America, good for America, and just really frame all of our conversations about what is good for the adults, the children, the future generations of Yerevan, the future generations in Baku, like that is the most important part. And so this is a long way of saying I want people to look at this conflict from the lens of the people in the country, not the belligerents, not the leaders of the country, and not the Russian influence, but how do we truly understand what has happened to Azeri people, and how do we truly understand what's happened to Armenian people, and how do we truly understand how they've been denied self-determination, and then how do we as outsiders create a geopolitical environment where they can actually have self-determination and flourish. Because in the big scheme of things, there's a bunch of people in Brussels and in Washington, D.C. who like want to integrate Armenian-Azerbaijan into Europe. And if Armenia and Azerbaijan want to integrate into Europe, then great. But that should be their decision, right? That shouldn't be something that is foisted on them as a condition of a treaty. That shouldn't be something that is foisted on them in order to get security guarantees against Russian aggression. Like these countries deserve self-determination, like every American would demand for themselves. And this is something I think about a lot. People around the world are expected to accept conditions that Americans would never tolerate for themselves when it comes to having other states interfere in their affairs.
A lot of this interaction and pull from the powerful has to do with economics, of course.
Absolutely.
So how do you talk about how the economics of the big powers impacts these smaller countries in the Caucasus?
When I talk about Azerbaijan and Armenia, I try to make sure that I talk about them as distinct people groups with distinct histories that have distinct interests. And their interests may not be aligned with Western interests. Their interests may not be aligned with Russian interests. Their interests may not be aligned with what I want in anything. But in the end, like these people groups decide and should decide their own pathway in the same way that UAE is done, right? So here in UAE, you have a country that punches above its weight on the global stage. Like in the big scheme of things, there's like 1 million Emiratis and then 9 million expats like me. But think about how often we hear about Dubai and how much we hear about Abu Dhabi in the news, right? And so one of the reasons why UAE is able to punch above its weight is that it essentially has kind of forged a pathway of neutrality. And their idea is that the Americans may have beef with whomever, but that's not our beef. We can partner with the Americans on defense. The Chinese may have beef with whoever, but that's not our beef. We'll partner with the Chinese on infrastructure. The Russians may have beef with whoever, but that's not our beef. We're going to take their investment dollars and we'll use those and we'll take foreign capital and we'll take a lot of Russians moving to Dubai, right? Okay. At the same time, the whole talk right now among a lot of people is that Baku is the next Dubai. And so there's a potentiality for Baku to become a destination for capital, for entrepreneurs, for people who like are looking for opportunities, because Azerbaijan sits on an ocean of natural gas and oil, and it's a thing we don't talk about very often, right? Like there's an opportunity for Azerbaijan to create an economy that is thriving and an opportunity to create an economy that like promotes the well-being of Azeri people. And can I say, by the way, that like I understand that people listening to this may have very, very strong views about like the current regime in Baku. What I'll say is that like people in Azerbaijan have a dignity and a quality of life that is actually better than a lot of people in the region. And like that's what they deserve. They deserve to flourish economically, they deserve to flourish politically, and they deserve to not have their futures dictated to them by outside powers. I keep hammering that, but like it's in this moment when we're looking at like the president of the United States going across the world and trying to end conflicts, like to his credit, he ended this conflict or he's brought us to the precipice of ending this conflict for Armenia and Azerbaijan. But just because you brought us to the precipice of ending the conflict doesn't mean you get to determine the future, right? And so the future that I want is a prosperous Baku that is like integrated into the global community, that is economically thriving, and that is moving towards some form of democratization that allows people in Azerbaijan to express themselves and to have say in their government. I want the same for Armenia. Like Armenia is further along the path of democratization, but like the economic prospects in Armenia are much worse than Azerbaijan, right? And so you essentially have two states that like if we mix them up they actually would be delightful, right? You've got like the economic powerhouse and then like the place where democratization has taken root, but they're not mixed up. And so they have their own unique set of situations and set of challenges that they deserve the right to sort themselves without Russian influence, without American influence, without influence from anybody else.
So if you come back to the South Caucasus 10 years from now, what would you hope to see politically, socially, and even in the way people live their daily lives?
Yeah, I would love to see a situation where there is peace. I would love to see mutually recognized borders. I would love to see economic cooperation. I would love to see the idea that I could catch a train in one country and then go to another, right? Like it's funny. So in my travels, I went to Georgia first, and then I went to Azerbaijan, then I went to Armenia. And I went in that order on purpose because I was essentially counseled that if you go to Baku with an Armenian passport stamp, like you may encounter some problems. And like I'm a Black American. I've got enough problems in my life. Like I ain't trying to be detained by authorities in Baku, right? And so it would be great to me to have a situation where I could actually travel through those contiguous states, and they have open borders that are peaceful. I was talking in my class this week about the establishment of the European community, and you have in Europe a situation where the Germans and the French went to war 3 times in like an 80-year period. And the Europeans realized that like, we can't do this. We can't keep rebuilding. We need to do something different. And they created economic interdependence between Germany and France. And so the history of that economic interdependence is that those countries have not had conflict in 80 years. And on the international stage, those countries are inseparable. And so I guess my hope, long way getting to this is that if I come back 10 years from now, that we see economic cooperation between the Caucasus states and economic integration and trade happening, because when goods are crossing borders, armies don't.
So looking back at your work as a teacher, traveler, host of the Nerd Farmer podcast, what are you ultimately trying to achieve? What do you hope people take away and learn from Nerd Farmer?
Wow. So that's a fascinating question. So when I started the show originally in 2017, it was a response to events in my local community back in Tacoma, Washington. And what I wanted to do was bring in local experts to talk about national problems, and then also to activate my local community, because it was my belief that like the solution to the problems that plague America are at the bottom up. The current political situation that we see in the United States is the result of basically a 40-year campaign of grassroots organizing on the political right, where they've built parallel institutions and essentially now are putting together a policy agenda that they've been planning since I was a child. And so what I wanted people to do, the very first episode, was stop worrying about the current administration and start getting active locally. That was my vision. But then in 2019, my wife and I moved overseas. And so the conversation changed a little bit there, because it's very weird to host a local podcast from 7,500 miles away. And so we do still have those local conversations, but like in the big scheme of things, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make my listeners really think about the world around them and to embrace the complexity of all of it. And so my guests are a mix of authors, politicians, policymakers, academics. And like really what I'm trying to do is just contextualize what we're seeing happening in the world and then talk about like the implications of that for us as human beings and also how we can get better about understanding the world. For a while, I did a series called Nerd Farmer Academy where I brought on university professors to kind of give me your best lecture, right? Teach me about the rise of fascism in the 1930s. Teach me about globalization. And so in the big scheme of things, what I'm trying to do for my, 10,000 or so listeners is really just make them more thoughtful about the world and offer them points of view they won't get elsewhere. And so that's why connecting with Savinch was so important because like, again, there's no Azeri voices in mainstream media, right? And so if you are a listener to my podcast, you have heard Savinch and I talk now 3 times about this conflict, okay? Like that means that the people who are listening to my show, when they hear President Trump talk about reaching an agreement over Nagorno-Karabakh between the Armenians and the Azeris, actually know like what the hell that means. And for most Americans, they couldn't find Azerbaijan on a map.
Thank you for your time. And before we finish, can you tell our viewers where they can listen to the Nerd Farmer podcast and how they can follow your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a website, natebowling.com. And if you go to natebowling.com, you can find the Nerd Farmer podcast. You can also find my weekly newsletter, Takes and Typos. And you can find my wife and my travel log, Bowlings Abroad. And on that website, we've kind of documented our travel throughout the region. So our trips to Armenia, Azerbaijan, to Georgia, to Kuwait, to Egypt, and all our adventures, even Uzbekistan. Like we've really enjoyed traveling around the world, and so all those things are there. Like I've walked away from social media kind of writ large, but natebowling.com is where you can find everything.
Terrific. Thank you for your time, Nate. This has been really fun to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.